Can't you answer when people are talking to you? The sharp voice sliced through the dinner rush. An elegant, elderly woman looked up, startled. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, her navy coat immaculate, yet confusion clouded her gentle eyes. She hadn't heard a single word. A man at the next table laughed and waved both hands inches from her face. Another customer copied random hand movements, turning her silence into a joke. Before the humiliation could deepen, a curvy waitress stepped between them. She calmly lowered the man's arm, then turned to the woman with the warmest smile. Instead of speaking, she raised her hands. "Welcome. I'm happy you're here. May I help you?" The elderly woman's trembling fingers answered instantly. Tears filled her eyes. The restaurant fell completely silent. No one understood the conversation unfolding in graceful movements, except one man standing near the entrance. His expression changed in an instant, because the woman everyone had mocked was his mother. The silence lingered for several heartbeats. The customers who had laughed only moments earlier suddenly found themselves staring at the table by the window, where the elderly woman and the waitress carried on an entire conversation without speaking a single word. Grace Bennett's hands moved with effortless confidence. "Would you prefer coffee before your meal?" Margaret DeLuca smiled and signed back. "Only if it's as good as your welcome." Grace laughed softly. "Our coffee is decent." "Our homemade soup is much better." Margaret chuckled, the deep lines around her eyes softening in a way they hadn't for months. For years, dining out had become exhausting. Servers grew impatient when she asked them to repeat themselves in sign language. Most simply pointed at the menu. Others exaggerated their lip movements, believing that speaking louder somehow made deafness disappear. Many people were kind. Few truly communicated. Grace did, without hesitation, without making it feel extraordinary. To her, it was simply the natural way to welcome a guest. She knelt slightly beside the table, so Margaret never had to strain her neck while signing. Every question was patient, every explanation was clear. "Today's special is roasted chicken with garlic potatoes. The tomato basil soup is homemade. If you have allergies, let me know." Margaret read every movement with ease. For the first time in a very long while, ordering dinner required no guessing. No embarrassment. No apologetic smiles. Only conversation. Across the room, Damian DeLuca remained near the entrance. He had entered, intending to surprise his mother after a late business meeting. Instead, he had stopped walking the moment he saw the waitress signing. He watched the ease between them. No forced sympathy. No performance. No expectation of praise. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She didn't even know she was being watched. Damian had spent years hiring assistants, private caregivers, translators, and staff members who claimed they understood accessibility. Yet many treated Margaret with careful politeness instead of genuine warmth. This waitress, she treated his mother exactly as she treated every other customer. Nothing more, nothing less. For reasons he couldn't explain, that simple truth struck him harder than any grand gesture ever had. When Grace returned carrying a steaming bowl of soup, she placed it gently before Margaret, before signing. "Careful, the bowl is hot." Margaret nodded gratefully. "Thank you, dear." Grace smiled. "Take your time. I'll check on you later." No awkward pity, no exaggerated patience, just quiet respect. Throughout the meal, Grace continued checking on every table with the same cheerful energy. She joked with regular customers, refilled coffee without being asked, remembered who preferred extra lemons with iced tea. And whenever she returned to Margaret, her hands flowed naturally back into sign language, as though changing languages required no more effort than taking another breath. Damian found himself smiling. He couldn't remember the last time he had seen his mother enjoying a meal this much. Margaret finished every bite, even dessert. When Grace brought the bill, Margaret reached out and gently touched her wrist. "Thank you," she signed. "You gave me something I almost forgot." Grace tilted her head. "What was that?" Margaret's eyes shimmered. "The feeling that I belong." For a brief second, Grace looked genuinely moved. Then she squeezed Margaret's hand with quiet affection. "You always belong here." No one noticed Damian lowering his gaze. Those 6 words lingered in his mind, long after they had been signed. As mother and son stepped outside into the cool Chicago evening, Margaret stopped beneath the restaurant's glowing sign. She turned toward Damian and signed with unmistakable determination. "We're coming back tomorrow." Damian raised an eyebrow. "Because the soup is that good?" Margaret laughed, shaking her head. Then she smiled the knowing smile only a mother could wear. "No, because I want you to meet the young woman who still remembers that kindness is a language." Damian looked back through the restaurant window. Inside, Grace was laughing with another elderly couple as she cleared their table. She still had no idea who either of them really was. And somehow, Damian hoped it would stay that way just a little longer. The next evening, Grace noticed him before he reached the hostess stand. Tall, impeccably dressed, dark charcoal suit, perfect posture. The kind of man who looked as though every minute of his day had already been scheduled by someone else. She smiled politely. "Welcome back." Damian nodded once. "Good evening." He glanced around the restaurant. Not searching for a table, searching for one person. Before he could ask, another familiar face appeared behind Grace. Margaret. The older woman waved enthusiastically before signing. "I told you we'd come back." Grace laughed and answered with her hands just as quickly. "I'm glad you did." Margaret introduced her son with a warm smile. "This is Damian." Grace offered her hand. "It's nice to finally meet you." Damian shook it gently. "The pleasure is mine." He almost admitted that he had already met her, at least from a distance, but decided against it. Some truths could wait. Grace led them to the same table by the window. When she handed Damian the menu, he studied it with complete seriousness. Every appetizer, every entree, every dessert. Grace waited patiently. Finally, she asked, "Need a recommendation?" He looked up. "What would you choose?" She smiled. "The tomato basil soup." He nodded immediately. "I'll have the tomato basil soup. And for your main course." He hesitated. "The roasted chicken." Grace grinned. "Excellent choice." Margaret covered her mouth, trying not to laugh. She knew perfectly well Damian almost never ate soup. Over the following week, the pattern repeated itself. Every evening, nearly the same time, same table, same calm expression, same order: tomato basil soup, roasted chicken, black coffee. Grace eventually stopped pretending not to notice. One rainy Tuesday, she set the soup in front of him before he even opened the menu. He looked mildly surprised. "I haven't ordered yet." She folded her arms dramatically. "Oh, really?" He blinked. "You were planning something different?" He considered it for a moment. "No, I thought so." Margaret laughed so hard she nearly spilled her tea. Grace pointed toward Damian with playful satisfaction. "I knew it." Damian raised an eyebrow. "So you're profiling customers now?" "I'm remembering them." "There's a difference?" "A very important one." She leaned in conspiratorially. "If I started profiling customers, I'd assume you secretly own a soup company." For the first time in days, Damian laughed. Not a polite smile, a genuine laugh. Several nearby diners turned toward the sound in surprise. Margaret simply watched the two of them with quiet delight. As the days passed, Grace discovered Damian was unexpectedly easy to tease. Whenever she asked whether he wanted to try something new, he always answered with complete confidence. Maybe tomorrow. Tomorrow never came. One afternoon, she placed 3 tiny sample spoons beside his bowl. He looked at them curiously. "What are these?" "A taste test." He frowned. "I didn't request one." "I know." She pointed at the samples. "Mushroom soup, potato leek, and chicken noodle." He looked back at his tomato soup. "I already have soup. You have commitment issues." "I do?" "You're committed to exactly 1 soup." Margaret signed while laughing. "She's right." Damian sighed with theatrical defeat. "I appear to be outnumbered." Grace folded her hands proudly. "That's because we're conducting an intervention." "What kind?" "A soup intervention." Even Damian couldn't suppress another smile. The regular customers began noticing him. Some assumed he was a food critic. Others believed he was an architect sketching ideas between bites. No one guessed the truth. Grace certainly didn't. To her, he was simply the quiet businessman who always tipped generously, thanked the kitchen, and somehow looked slightly less serious every time he walked through the front door. She appreciated one thing above all else. He never interrupted her conversations with Margaret. When Grace signed, Damian patiently waited. He never demanded spoken translations. He understood enough sign language to follow the basics, yet allowed the 2 women their own conversations. That small courtesy impressed Grace more than expensive watches or tailored suits ever could. Respect wasn't loud. It appeared in moments like those. One evening, after the dinner rush had finally slowed, Grace placed fresh coffee before Damian. "I've been meaning to ask you something." He looked up. "What is it?" She smiled mischievously. "Are you actually addicted to our soup?" He stared at the steaming bowl for several seconds. "I wouldn't call it addiction." "No, it's consistent." Grace laughed. "That's the most businessman's answer I've ever heard." Margaret signed toward her son. "Tell her the truth." Damian glanced at his mother before calmly replying, "The soup brought me here once." Grace nodded triumphantly. "I knew it." He looked directly into her eyes. "But that's not why I keep coming back." She waited for him to continue. Instead, he quietly lifted another spoonful of soup. Grace rolled her eyes with an amused smile. "Fine. Keep your mysterious secrets." As she walked away, she never noticed Margaret watching her son with a knowing expression. A mother didn't need words to recognize the look in her son's eyes. He wasn't returning for the soup anymore. He simply hadn't found the courage to admit it yet. By the 3rd week, Damian had become part of the restaurant's rhythm. The cooks greeted him with a nod before he even reached his seat. The elderly couple who came every Friday always waved. A little boy insisted on calling him Soup Guy. Damian accepted the nickname with surprising dignity. Grace, on the other hand, found endless amusement in it. One evening, she placed his bowl on the table and said with exaggerated formality, "Your usual, Mr. Soup Guy." Margaret laughed so hard that even the customers nearby smiled without knowing why. Damian simply sighed. "I fear I've lost all professional credibility." Grace shrugged innocently. "You lost it around bowl number 12. He opened his mouth to defend himself before quietly admitting, "It may have been 13. Grace grinned. "I appreciate honesty." The warmth between them had become effortless. No grand declarations. No flirtatious games. Just comfort. It was the kind of connection that quietly grew stronger each day, without either of them realizing how much they had begun looking forward to it. That evening was unusually slow. Rain drummed softly against the restaurant windows, keeping many customers at home. Grace finally had a few moments to sit beside Margaret while she finished dessert. The older woman signed, "You always look after everyone else. Who looks after you?" Grace smiled gently. "I'm fine." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "That's not an answer." Grace laughed. "You remind me of my grandmother." Margaret squeezed her hand. "Then answer honestly." For a moment, Grace stared into her untouched cup of coffee. The cheerful smile she wore every day softened into something quieter and something older. I learned a long time ago that taking care of people becomes a habit. Margaret waited patiently. Grace continued signing. My little brother, Ethan, was born completely deaf. Across the room, Damian looked up instinctively. He had never asked why Grace knew American Sign Language. He simply assumed she had studied it. Now he found himself listening with unexpected attention. Grace's hands moved slowly, every sign carrying years of memories. Our parents worked 2 jobs each. Bills were always waiting. Appointments, school meetings, doctors. Someone always had to explain everything. She smiled faintly. Eventually, that someone became me. She remembered standing on a chair at 8 years old so she could sign across the kitchen table, reading letters from school aloud before translating every sentence, helping her brother understand birthday invitations, parent-teacher conferences, medical appointments, even ordering hamburgers at fast food restaurants. Signing had never been homework. It had simply become another language spoken inside their home. I don't remember deciding to learn it, Grace said softly. I just grew up using it. Margaret's eyes shimmered. Did you ever resent it? Grace answered immediately. Never. She smiled toward the kitchen, where children laughed near the dessert display. My brother never asked to be born into a world that expected him to struggle. If learning his language made life easier, why wouldn't I? Damian lowered his eyes. The answer echoed inside him long after Grace stopped signing. Why wouldn't I? So many people had treated accessibility as charity. Grace had never viewed it that way. To her, communication wasn't generosity. It was respect. Suddenly, every interaction over the past few weeks made perfect sense. She remembered customers' names because she genuinely cared. She knelt beside elderly diners because it was easier for them. She never rushed people who needed extra time. She instinctively noticed who felt invisible. Kindness wasn't something she performed. It was simply who she had become. Later that evening, Grace helped an elderly veteran read the small print on the menu. Minutes afterward, she carried crayons to entertain 2 restless children. Then she quietly packed leftovers for a homeless man who always insisted on paying with spare change. She accepted every coin with the same gratitude she showed customers who left $100 tips. Damian watched each moment without interrupting. No cameras, no applause, no audience worth impressing. Only quiet acts of compassion, repeated over and over again. For years, he had attended charity galas where wealthy donors gave speeches about changing the world. Grace changed someone's world before lunchtime, almost every day. She simply never talked about it. When the restaurant finally emptied, Damian stood to leave. Grace walked him toward the entrance. You look unusually serious tonight. He considered telling her everything. Who he was, why he had first noticed her, why his mother now smiled more than she had in years. Instead, he asked a different question. Do you ever wish your life had been easier? Grace thought for several seconds. Sometimes. Then she smiled. But if life had been easier, I might never have learned the things that matter most. What things? She looked toward Margaret, who was putting on her coat. Patience. She glanced toward the kitchen, where the exhausted dishwasher was laughing with the cook. Compassion. Finally, her eyes returned to Damian. And remembering that everyone is carrying a story you can't see. Those words settled quietly between them. Damian realized something that both surprised and unsettled him. He had spent years admiring intelligence, power, discipline, ambition, yet none of those qualities had ever reached him the way this woman did. He wasn't falling in love because she was beautiful, although she was. He wasn't falling in love because she made him laugh. He was falling in love because she possessed something infinitely rarer, a heart that chose kindness even when no one was watching. As he helped his mother into the waiting car, Margaret signed one simple question. "Well?" Damian looked back at the warm lights of the little neighborhood restaurant. Grace was already helping another employee stack chairs before closing. He smiled to himself. For the first time in years, the most feared man in Chicago realized he was looking forward to tomorrow for one very ordinary reason. He couldn't wait to see one extraordinary waitress again. Autumn arrived, bringing crisp evenings and the restaurant's annual charity fundraising dinner. Every table was reserved. Local business owners mingled with longtime customers, community leaders, and families who had supported the restaurant for years. The proceeds would help fund free meals for senior citizens and low-income families throughout the winter. Grace had volunteered to work the entire event. She never minded the extra hours if it meant helping someone else. Vanessa Hill, however, viewed the evening very differently. As the restaurant's supervisor, she had spent days obsessing over appearances. Fresh flowers decorated every table. Crystal glasses replaced the usual tumblers. Uniforms were inspected twice before guests arrived. Yet every time Vanessa looked across the dining room, her eyes landed on Grace. Not because Grace had done anything wrong, because customers naturally gravitated toward her. People smiled when she approached. Regulars asked for her section. Even first-time visitors somehow relaxed after only a few moments in her company. It infuriated Vanessa. In her mind, a high-end dining experience depended on elegance, image, and flawless presentation. Grace's warm personality kept proving that genuine kindness mattered far more. That evening, Damian and Margaret entered together. Several guests immediately recognized Damian as the celebrated chairman of DeLuca Enterprises. Quiet whispers spread through the room. "Isn't that Damian DeLuca? I didn't know he came here. What is someone like him doing in this neighborhood restaurant?" Grace noticed none of it. She simply welcomed Margaret with a bright smile and signed, "It's wonderful to see you again." Margaret hugged her without hesitation. The affectionate gesture drew even more curious glances. Vanessa watched everything from across the room. Something finally clicked. The influential businessman wasn't returning because of the restaurant. He was returning because of Grace. Jealousy settled heavily inside her. As dinner progressed, the restaurant owner invited several employees onto the small stage to thank them for organizing the fundraiser. Grace tried to remain near the back. She disliked public attention. Vanessa had other plans. With an overly sweet smile, she called into the microphone, "Grace, don't hide. Come stand up here, where everyone can see you." Applause encouraged Grace forward. She smiled awkwardly and joined the others. Vanessa draped an arm around her shoulders. Everyone loves Grace. More applause followed. For one brief moment, Grace believed the compliment was sincere. Then Vanessa continued, "Although I still keep telling her, if she ever wants to represent this restaurant properly, she should probably spend a little less time tasting the desserts." A few uncomfortable laughs echoed through the room. Grace's smile disappeared. Vanessa wasn't finished. "I suppose confidence comes easily when wealthy customers are willing to overlook appearances." She glanced deliberately toward Damian. Some people certainly know how to attract attention. The implication hung heavily in the air. Several guests exchanged uneasy looks. Others lowered their eyes in embarrassment. Grace felt every face in the room turning toward her. It wasn't the first cruel comment she had heard about her body, not even close. She remembered classmates whispering that no one would ever love a girl her size. Co-workers suggesting she belonged in the kitchen instead of the dining room. Customers asking for a prettier waitress. She had learned to smile through most of it. Tonight felt different, because the humiliation had become public. She slowly lowered her head, not out of shame, out of exhaustion. She was simply tired of defending the space she occupied in the world. Across the ballroom, Margaret's expression changed completely. Her gentle smile vanished. She looked from Vanessa to Grace, then toward her son. She didn't need to ask what he was thinking. She already knew. Damian remained perfectly still. Too still. Those who knew him in the corporate world recognized that silence. It was never a sign of hesitation. It was the calm that came before an irreversible decision. His gaze settled on Grace. She wasn't crying. She wasn't arguing. She wasn't trying to humiliate Vanessa in return. Instead, she quietly picked up the serving tray she had set aside earlier. She seemed ready to step down from the stage and return to work, as though none of it had happened. That simple act struck Damian harder than the insult itself. She was protecting everyone else's evening, even after someone had tried to destroy hers. Margaret reached across the table and gently touched her son's hand. Their eyes met. Without signing a single word, a lifetime of understanding passed between mother and son. Damian rose slowly from his chair. The ballroom grew silent once again. This time, not because someone had been mocked, but because everyone sensed that something unforgettable was about to happen. Every conversation in the ballroom faded into silence. Damian DeLuca walked toward the stage with measured, unhurried steps. No anger showed on his face, no raised voice, no dramatic expression. Those who recognized him expected a powerful businessman to intervene. Those who knew his hidden reputation understood something far more dangerous. Damian never acted impulsively. When he made a decision, it was final. Grace looked up in surprise as he stopped beside her. For a moment, she thought he intended to reassure her with a few polite words before returning to his table. Instead, he reached for her hand. Not possessively, not theatrically, simply and naturally, as though standing beside her was the most obvious place in the room. Grace instinctively looked at him. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. His answer was calm. "I know. That's exactly why I will." A ripple of whispers swept across the audience. Vanessa's confident smile began to fade. Without releasing Grace's hand, Damian turned toward Margaret. Instead of speaking, he raised his free hand and began signing. Every movement was steady, deliberate, filled with quiet affection. "Mother, this is the woman I told you about." Margaret stood slowly, her eyes filled with tears before she even finished reading the sentence. She nodded with unmistakable pride. "Yes. She's exactly the woman I hoped she would be." The guests watched the silent exchange in complete confusion. Few understood American Sign Language, yet everyone understood emotion. Margaret's trembling smile, Grace's stunned expression, the tenderness in Damian's eyes. Words suddenly seemed unnecessary. Damian finally faced the room. His voice remained low. The silence forced everyone to listen. "When my mother was mocked in this restaurant several weeks ago," many guests looked around in surprise. "I watched people grow impatient because she could not hear them. I watched others laugh. I watched strangers treat her silence as though it made her less worthy of respect." He paused. Only one person stood between her and that cruelty. His eyes turned toward Grace. "She didn't ask who my mother was. She didn't know our family's name. She didn't expect gratitude. She simply welcomed another human being." The ballroom remained perfectly still. "You applauded tonight because this event supports kindness." He glanced briefly toward Vanessa. "But kindness is meaningless if we only celebrate it after someone important walks through the door." Grace felt tears gathering, despite every effort to remain composed. She had spent years convincing herself that being overlooked was easier than being hurt. Now, an entire room was looking at her. Not with pity, with respect. Damian gently squeezed her hand before continuing. My family has resources. We have influence. We have wealth. He shook his head once. But none of those things gave my mother what this woman gave her. He looked toward Margaret again. My mother walked into this restaurant, expecting another lonely dinner. Grace reminded her that she still belonged in the world. Several guests quietly wiped away tears. Even members of the kitchen staff stood motionless near the serving doors. Damian drew a slow breath. Then he spoke the sentence that no one in the room would ever forget. The only person here who deserves applause is the woman who made my mother feel heard. Without ever hearing her voice, for one heartbeat, no one moved. Then Margaret began clapping. Slowly, proudly. One pair of hands became 10. 10 became 50. Within seconds, the ballroom erupted into a standing ovation. The applause echoed through every corner of the restaurant. Several long-time customers stood with tears in their eyes. The elderly veteran Grace had once helped was the first to whistle. Families rose together. Even the musicians stopped playing so they could applaud. Grace covered her mouth, overwhelmed. She had spent so much of her life believing people noticed only her size. For the first time, an entire room saw her heart. Vanessa remained frozen beside the microphone. The confidence she had worn all evening disappeared beneath the weight of dozens of disappointed faces. The restaurant owner slowly stepped onto the stage. His expression carried none of his usual warmth. Vanessa, she swallowed nervously. This charity exists because our restaurant believes every guest deserves dignity. He glanced toward Grace. You publicly violated the very values we claim to represent. Vanessa hurried to defend herself. I was only joking. No, the owner interrupted quietly. You were humiliating one of the finest employees I've ever had. He removed the event badge clipped to her jacket. You no longer represent this restaurant. The words landed with unmistakable finality. Vanessa stared in disbelief. No one argued. No one defended her. The room had already reached its own conclusion. Grace turned toward Damian, still struggling to process everything that had happened. You didn't have to change your evening because of me. He smiled gently. No. I changed it because someone needed to remind this room what real strength looks like. She blinked away fresh tears. And what does real strength look like? Damian looked directly into her eyes. It looks like a woman who chooses kindness after the world has given her every reason to become bitter. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The applause had faded. The ballroom slowly returned to life. Yet for Grace, nothing would ever feel quite the same again. Somewhere deep inside, a heart that had spent years doubting its own worth had finally begun to believe it deserved to be loved. The charity dinner ended hours later, but Grace remained behind to help clean the restaurant. She always insisted on staying until the last chair was pushed in and the final tablecloth folded. Work had a way of quieting her thoughts. Tonight, it wasn't working. She replayed Vanessa's words, then Damian's. She had spent years believing the world noticed only her appearance. Yet somehow, one man had looked beyond it from the very beginning. Even so, she couldn't understand why. As she carried a box of donations toward the storage room, headlights swept across the front windows. A familiar black sedan stopped outside. Grace smiled faintly. Your favorite customer is back, one of the cooks teased. I think we ran out of soup. Grace rolled her eyes. Very funny. When she stepped outside, Damian was waiting beside the car, while Margaret remained comfortably seated inside. The cool evening breeze carried the scent of autumn leaves through the quiet street. For the first time since they had met, neither of them immediately spoke. Damian broke the silence. I owe you the truth. Grace folded her arms lightly. I was wondering when that conversation would happen. He gave a small smile. You already know I'm chairman of DeLuca Enterprises. She nodded. The entire restaurant learned that tonight. There is more. His expression grew serious. My family has another life. A complicated one. Grace listened quietly. There are people who fear my name. There are decisions I make that never appear in newspapers. I don't pretend my world is simple. He stopped there. He didn't romanticize it. He didn't boast about power. He didn't offer details that would burden her. He simply told her that the life behind the public image carried responsibilities few people could imagine. Grace looked at him for a long moment. So, the quiet man who kept eating tomato soup is one of the most powerful people in Chicago, he answered honestly. Yes. She laughed softly in disbelief. I've been teasing you for weeks. You have. I called you Mr. Soup Guy. You did. And you never once corrected me. I liked the nickname. They both laughed, allowing the tension to soften. The laughter faded. Grace lowered her eyes. I don't think people like us belong in the same story. Damian frowned slightly. What do you mean? You have boardrooms. She looked down at her apron. I carry dinner plates. You attend charity galas. I work double shifts. People expect you to marry someone. She searched for the right words. Someone who looks like she belongs beside you. Her voice remained calm. Years of insecurity had taught her not to cry too quickly. I've spent enough of my life being reminded that I'm too much. Too big. Too ordinary. I don't want to become another person who disappoints you. For several seconds, Damian said nothing. Not because he lacked an answer, because he wanted every word to matter. He stepped closer. Before speaking aloud, he raised his hands. Grace instinctively watched. His signs were slower than hers. Not perfect, but unmistakably sincere. Thank you. He paused, choosing each movement with care. For giving my mother back something money never could. Grace felt tears gather immediately. No expensive gift. No medical treatment. No fortune. Only dignity. Only belonging. Only love expressed through a language she had learned as a child. When Damian lowered his hands, he finally spoke. The first evening, I came back because the soup really was excellent. Grace smiled through damp eyes. I knew it. He smiled back. But every day after that, his voice softened. I came back for you. The world around them seemed to disappear. No traffic. No distant conversations. Only two people standing beneath the warm glow of the restaurant sign. I admired your kindness before I admired your smile. I respected your heart before I realized I was falling in love. And somewhere between bowl number 3, he laughed quietly. And bowl number 13, I stopped imagining a future that didn't include you. Grace laughed through her tears. I knew 13 sounded suspicious. The restaurant door opened gently behind them. Neither of them noticed. Margaret stood just inside, watching without interrupting. She had waited years to see that expression on her son's face. Peace. Real peace. Grace finally whispered. I'm still afraid. Damian nodded. So am I. Our worlds are different. They are. There will be difficult days. There will. She searched his face. Then why are you so certain? He reached for her hand once again. Because this time, he wasn't rescuing her. He was asking to walk beside her. I'm certain, because every place I've ever entered became quieter after people learned who I was. He smiled gently. But every place you enter becomes warmer, simply because you're there. I've spent my whole life building an empire. You've spent yours building people. I know which one matters more. Grace closed the distance between them and rested her forehead lightly against his. You make it very difficult to argue with you. I've had excellent motivation. And what was that? You. She laughed. The sound was bright enough to make Margaret wipe away another happy tear. For the first time in many years, the feared man who could command an entire city felt something infinitely greater than power. He felt home. 6 months later, the ballroom inside the DeLuca Foundation looked very different from the restaurant where everything had begun. Instead of elegant dinner tables, the room was filled with restaurant owners, hotel managers, nurses, emergency responders, and community volunteers from across Chicago. Large banners displayed a simple message: every voice deserves to be understood. What had started as one waitress welcoming one customer had grown into a city-wide initiative. With the support of the DeLuca Foundation, Grace had accepted a new role as Director of Community Outreach. Her first project was the one closest to her heart: free American Sign Language training for restaurants, hospitals, hotels, and public service workers throughout Chicago. Grace stood near the front of the room, greeting every participant with the same warm smile that had once welcomed Margaret into a small neighborhood restaurant. Only now, hundreds of people had come to learn the language that had changed 3 lives forever. The first training session ended with enthusiastic applause. Servers practiced simple greetings. Receptionists learned how to ask, "How may I help you?" Doctors practiced introducing themselves before discussing treatment. For many, it was their first experience with sign language. For Grace, it felt like watching the world become just a little more welcoming. Margaret watched proudly from the front row. Her eyes shone with quiet happiness as dozens of strangers signed their first awkward but heartfelt sentences. Years earlier, she had stopped believing public spaces could ever feel comfortable again. Now, she watched an entire community trying to change that. A local reporter approached Damian as photographers gathered nearby. "What first made you notice Grace?" she asked. The room grew quiet. Damian looked toward Grace, who was laughing as she corrected a young waiter's hand position during a lesson. A gentle smile crossed his face. Everyone else saw a waitress. He paused. "My mother saw someone who spoke her language." He looked at Grace with unmistakable affection. "And I saw the woman who changed both our lives." Cameras flashed, yet neither of them seemed to notice. Some moments were too genuine to be interrupted by attention. As the ceremony came to an end, Grace walked toward Margaret. There were speeches she could have given, long emotional thank you messages, endless explanations about how much this family had come to mean to her. Instead, she simply raised her hands. 3 gentle signs. "We're family now." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She answered without hesitation, "Always." The 2 women embraced tightly. No applause was needed. No translation was necessary. Love had found its own language, long before words ever could. Across the room, Damian watched them with quiet gratitude. Power had built his business. Money had opened countless doors. But neither had ever given his mother what one compassionate waitress had offered on an ordinary evening in a small restaurant: the simple gift of being seen. And in giving that gift, Grace Bennett had found something she never expected to receive herself: a family, a future, and a love that had begun with nothing more than a warm smile and 2 welcoming hands.